Most of you know that Unitarianism and Universalism began as two different belief systems, not churches, within early Christianity. For the first 300 years of Christianity, bishops and priests were free to preach their own theology. Unitarian belief was common. God was the Father, Jesus Christ was the Son, but not God. The doctrine of the Trinity was established at the Council of Nicaea in 325. At that point, the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope became the final authority, and belief in the unity of God was ruled a heresy. Heresy comes from a Greek word that means choice, but that isn't what they meant by it. The Universalist belief that God was a loving God who would not alienate anyone from his presence for all times. Universal salvation was a dominant Christian belief taught in 5 of the 7 major schools of theology for the first 500 years of Christianity. The Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553 declared universal salvation to be a heresy. The Roman Catholic Church ruled Europe until the Protestant Revolution began in the 16th century, at which time beliefs in universal salvation and the unity of God again resurfaced. Although the Protestant Revolution opened the doors to new beliefs, it did not exactly usher in a time of religious freedom. People were killed over their differing religious beliefs. The Spaniard Michael Servetus, with Unitarian beliefs, published On the Errors of the Trinity in 1531. His views were widely denounced, and he moved from country to country throughout Europe to avoid persecution. He was burned at the stake for heresy in 1553 by order of the Protestant Geneva Governing Council in Geneva, Switzerland. In 1556, Francis David preached against the doctrine of the Trinity in Transylvania. His preaching won over King John Sigismund, as well as many of the people of Transylvania, to Unitarianism. Transylvania had the first formal Unitarian church in the world. In 1568, King John Sigismund issued the Edict of Torda, proclaiming religious toleration for the people of Transylvania. Each citizen could have his or her own religious beliefs. This was a first in Christendom. King John Sigismund died young and without heirs and was replaced by a Catholic king who eventually imprisoned Francis David, who was by then the Unitarian bishop, for the crime of innovation. David died in prison in 1579. Unitarianism became a persecuted faith in Transylvania, but continued through the centuries and is still alive in present-day Romania. In spite of its presence in Europe, British Unitarianism seems to have developed on its own, simply as people reading the Bible could find no basis for the doctrine of the Trinity. The success of the American Revolution influenced liberal thought in this new nation. The tiny colonies that had defeated the Lion of Britain now doubted whether man was really born with innate depravity, original sin. Surely God had conceived of man in his own image, with unlimited potential, and therefore would not utterly condemn him. Some famous Unitarians at the time of the American Revolution are Paul Revere and President John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Universalism, as its own religion, wasn't formalized until after John Murray arrived in the American colonies in 1770. And you heard the story of John Murray and Thomas Potter in the Story for All Ages this morning. When Murray's ministry was reborn, he carried the message of universal salvation throughout New England and settled in Massachusetts. He remarried to a leading feminist writer of the age, Judith Sargent Singer, and served the first Universalist church in America, which was dedicated in 1780. This church was founded by former members of a Congregationalist congregation and successfully sued the town over the taxes they were forced to pay the Congregationalist church. It was the first step in seeking separation of church and state in Massachusetts. Murray's preaching and writing spawned more Universalist churches and ministers. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a Universalist and wrote tirelessly about applying Universalism in the world. He contended that political and social activism was inseparable from Universalism, and in 1790 laid out the programs that Universalists would support for generations to come: opposition to slavery, temperance, prison reform, peace, and working for the poor. Joseph Priestley, a Unitarian minister and the scientist credited with the discovery of oxygen, became the first Universalist Unitarian when he publicly declared that he believed in universal salvation in 1796. The Unitarians were horrified. In 1802, the oldest pilgrim church in America, the church at Plymouth, became Unitarian. Jose Ballou, born in 1771, was raised in a strictly Calvinist Baptist family. He was excommunicated from his father's church after adopting a radical universalist belief that all would go to heaven immediately upon death, because sin was punished during life. With very little education, he became an itinerant Universalist preacher and clashed with John Murray over differing beliefs. Murray believed that sin during one's life would be punished after death, before one was restored to God. Now, this was the crux of a split in Universalism that was taken very seriously, whether all went to heaven immediately or only after suffering for their sins while on earth. The conflict was based on that widely held belief that it was threat of punishment that induced people to be good. The Winchester Profession of Faith, adopted at a Universalist General Convention in 1803, was crafted to agree with John Murray's theology, Restorationist Universalism. It was adopted with less conflict than usually surrounds such documents because it contained an escape clause at the end. And where the brethren cannot see alike, they may agree to differ, and let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. In response, Jose Ballou published his Treatise on Atonement in 1805, the first book published in America openly rejecting the doctrine of the Trinity. Remember, he's a Universalist. Ballou used reason to interpret Scripture and insisted on an all-powerful, all-loving God. He dismantled the Trinity by logic so well that within 10 years of its publication, almost all Universalists were Unitarian in theology and committed to rational interpretation of the Bible. The people who would adopt the name Unitarian 25 years later, but were then just various kinds of liberal Christian, didn't like Ballou or his theology, in part because they believed in hell, but mostly because Ballou was uneducated, though brilliant, and his congregants were come-outers from Baptist, Quaker, Methodist, and German sects, and mostly of the lower classes. Ballou's belief in immediate restoration to God upon death became known as ultra-universalism, while Murray's brand was dubbed restorationist universalism. The controversy raged for years, with a schism resulting in 1830 when 12 societies separated from the New England Convention of Universalists. The restorationists, those who believed in a period of atonement, met separately for 10 years and then faded away. Many had joined Unitarian congregations, which had by that time adopted Restorationist Universalism into its theology. In 1811, Maria Cook became the first woman to preach in a Universalist pulpit. The Universalists were the first denomination to ordain a woman, Lydia Ann Moulton Jenkins in 1860, and the more famous Olympia Brown in 1863. While the prejudices of the day against women existed within Universalism, there was a general sense of the spiritual equality of women and men. Harvard Divinity School was established in 1811 as the primary training ground for Unitarian ministers. Until 1870, it was exclusively Unitarian. It is still one of a handful of schools where one can get a UU ministry education in this country. The American Unitarian Association was founded in 1825. By that time, more than 100 of the formerly congregational churches in Massachusetts had embraced Unitarian theology. Most of those that did not would eventually become United Church of Christ. Today we consider those our cousins. In 1835, the Boston Recorder named Universalism the reigning heresy of the day. It was 1 year before Transcendentalism became a major cultural movement, which no doubt won the award in a later year. Transcendentalism spoke to huge controversy within Unitarianism. Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson stripped scripture and clergy of their spiritual and moral authority and returned it to the individual to discern through reason and experience. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker denied Christianity's claims of special revelation and widened truth beyond traditional Christian constructs. Emerson and Henry David Thoreau cultivated a personal relationship with the universe through solitude in nature. And this aspect of spiritual practice remains relevant to UUs today. Other important transcendentalists were Margaret Fuller, Amos Bronson Alcott, Elizabeth Peabody, and Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker wrote to a friend in 1847, "The Universalists are more human than we. They declare the fatherhood of God and stick at the consequences. Everlasting happiness to all men. I think they are the most human sect in the land." Conservative Universalists responded to Transcendentalism by passing a resolution affirming the Bible as God's word revealed and all that was necessary for faith and practice. But the Universalists were still dedicated to scholarship. Most education at that time was religious in nature, and Universalist parents, tired of their children coming home from elementary school and telling them they were going to hell, does this sound familiar? Began opening their own schools across New England and then into the Midwest. These schools were open to all, and no effort was made to convert children to Universalism. Perhaps in response to the blatant snobbery of Unitarianism's Harvard graduates, Universalists opened many colleges and universities. Some that survive to this day are Tufts, St. Lawrence, Bucknell, which is now University of Akron, and Throop, which became the California Institute of Technology. By the mid-1800s, Universalism was the 5th or 6th largest denomination in the country, with perhaps as many as 800,000 members. Universal salvation was a welcome alternative to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, wherein God had chosen before they were born the elect who would be allowed into heaven. When Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species was published in America in 1860, conservative Unitarians and Universalists were threatened along with all of Christendom. What they saw as a scientific attack on the Bible was, however, defended by Universalist theologian Thomas B. Thayer, who cited Darwin's work as proof that a thinking God is still at work in the world, in charge of the evolutionary process. This argument led to a wholehearted acceptance of evolution by both churches, after only 4 decades of debate. Trouble was brewing in the country in the mid-1800s as abolitionists and supporters of slavery clashed over the most divisive issue of the day. Universalists declared slavery to be inconsistent with their beliefs in 1841. Many prominent Unitarians supported the anti-slavery movement, but as most Unitarians were of the upper classes, there was some sympathy among them for the rights of the gentry of the South. 2 famous Universalists emerged during the Civil War: Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, who provided care to the wounded where they fell and recruited help with resources from all her friends. Following the war, she organized the American Red Cross. The other was Thomas Starr King, a Universalist minister serving the Unitarian Church in San Francisco during the war. He spoke passionately in the towns and gold camps of California, persuaded the new territory to stay with the Union, and raised $1.5 million for the Sanitary Commission. The state of California honored King with a statue in the National Statuary Hall collection in Washington, D.C. In 2009, it was replaced by one of Ronald Reagan. The Sanitary Commission was founded by Unitarian Henry Whitney Bellows in 1861 in response to the appalling unsanitary conditions of the Union Army camps. Clara Barton worked with him, and the Sanitary Commission is considered to be the precursor to the American Red Cross. Unitarian Robert Gould Shaw led the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the first regiment of free black men in the Union Army. He is buried with his troops where he died at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. During the Civil War years, the practice of higher criticism of the Bible was imported from Germany and was spread in this country by Universalist Aurelio Kohn. Literary science had proved that the Bible was not a unified work, but rather a compilation of writings, and its authors were largely names chosen for their fame and authority. The Bible could no longer be accepted as literal truth by learned men. Shortly after the war, Unitarian Henry Berg founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, today's SPCA. Berg later used the new laws against animal cruelty in the first case to protect a child from physical abuse. He went on to found the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children and worked tirelessly for the rest of his life to enact laws and prosecute cases protecting both animals and children from suffering. Following the Civil War, Universalists opened schools for freed slaves to educate children for their new lives and freedom. But the second half of the 1800s saw a decline in Universalism's numbers. The message of universal salvation was so popular that it had worked its way into a majority of mainstream Protestant faiths, and the Universalist Church had less to attract followers. The Unitarians were slow to recognize women in ministry, slower than the Universalists, but in 1875, 21 Unitarian women ministers organized the Iowa Sisterhood and undertook to establish and maintain churches in the Great Plains. One woman, Anna Jane Norris, made it as far west as Fort Collins, Colorado, where she founded a Unitarian church and served from 1883 to 1887. The Iowa Sisterhood was scorned by their male counterparts back east, but succeeded in founding and or serving over 30 churches in the Midwest before they were forced out of ministry in 1900 by a new president of the American Unitarian Association who locked the doors against women ministers. The first black minister, Joseph Jordan, was ordained by the Universalists in 1889. He served an interracial mission school in Norfolk, Virginia. The school was well supported both financially and morally for over 70 years by local Universalist churches and the Universalist denomination. In 1899, the Universalist General Convention in Boston adopted a creed called the Chicago Declaration that included Unitarian theology and the certainty of just retribution for sin. With this, the restoration had said once, there was to be no get into heaven free card. The most influential Universalist of the 20th century was Clarence R. Skinner, the professor of applied Christianity at Tufts College from 1914 to 1945. He called for ecumenical social action and sought to transform churches into agencies for transforming the society around them. Skinner's call to social action has guided first Universalism and now the Unitarian Universalism into the 21st century. The First World War sparked a religious crisis around the world. Questioning the role of God in the face of the atrocities of war brought in doubts about God's very existence and ushered in the religious humanist movement. In 1933, the Humanist Manifesto was signed by 34 men, including 15 Unitarian ministers and 1 Universalist minister. Humanism exercised a tremendous influence on Unitarianism and later UUism for much of the 20th century. Some of its principles are firmly embedded in UU beliefs today. Showing love to all humans. Immortality is found in the examples we set and the work we do. We gain insight from many sources and all cultures. We have the power within ourselves to realize the best we are capable of as human beings. And we are responsible for what we do and become. Although humanism was largely not supported by Universalists, the controversy around it probably provoked their new statement of faith in 1935, which includes references to the supreme worth of every human personality and the power of men of goodwill and sacrificial spirit to overcome all evil and progressively establish the kingdom of God. Their new statement also sidestepped the authority of the Bible, any definition of the relationship between Jesus and God, the existence of heaven, and any mention of salvation. It placed the responsibility on mankind to heal the world, a cornerstone of humanist belief. Universalists were working toward a universalism that was not about salvation, but about universal religion. As humanist beliefs became more accepted, Unitarians and Universalists realized that Christian faith need not be the only right path, and the writings of Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, and other faiths began to be used in services as equal to the Bible. In the post-war era, our society became more mobile. Interfaith marriages became more common, and many interfaith couples found a home within Unitarian Universalism, broadening the beliefs and practices within our congregations. In 1949, the Massachusetts Universalist Convention charged the Reverend Kenneth Patton with establishing a new church, the Charles Street Meeting House in Boston, which was to be used with a new style of worship and liturgy and dedicated to being a religion for all. The round sanctuary was ornamented with flags and art objects symbolic of world religions. Its altar was a bookshelf housing sacred writings from around the world. Patton's innovations shocked the Orthodox, but were embraced by both Unitarians and Universalists, and the religious symbols on the walls of this church are influenced by the work of the Reverend Patton. Following the Second World War, people increasingly left their small towns and rural areas and moved into large cities for factory jobs. Smaller Universalist churches were abandoned. Universalist numbers were dwindling to a crisis level. At the same time, Unitarianism was enjoying a growth surge as liberal religious thought attracted newly college-educated veterans. Discussions about merging the two denominations had taken place for decades. They'd been sharing a hymnal and children's curricula since the 30s, and their youth groups and women groups had both merged in 1953. Humanism was at its height within Unitarianism, and Universalists feared losing their liberal Christian identity to those godless Unitarians. In spite of these fears, institutional consolidation took place in May of 1961. Universalism was swallowed up by Unitarianism to a large extent, but not completely. The Universalist values of social justice are embedded in Unitarian Universalism today. And becoming a church universal, serving all races and cultures, is still a UU ideal. The feminist movement began in the 1960s, and over the course of 3 decades, sweeping changes in laws and cultural expectations about women took place. In 1972, there were 23 women active in Unitarian Universalist ministry. In 1999, there were 431, and today well over half of UU ministers are female, and it is expected that women will have at least an equal role in church governance. With feminist theology came the rediscovery of earth-centered beliefs and the ancient goddess religions. Wiccan and pagan groups emerged, and the women's movement brought the water ceremony and candles of joy and concern to UU congregations. In 1965, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for clergy members to join him in Selma, Alabama, to march for voting rights for African Americans. The Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Association was meeting when that telegram arrived, and they immediately adjourned to go to his aid. 20% of UU ministers traveled to Selma to assist in the civil rights protests. 3 white UU ministers were beaten on a sidewalk in Selma, and the Reverend James Reed died of his injuries. 2 weeks later, white UU laywoman Viola Liuzzo from Detroit was shot to death for transporting a Negro in her car between Selma and Montgomery. After the Stonewall riots of 1969, the UUA's General Assembly passed a resolution to end discrimination against gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. In 1971, the first lesbian services of union were performed by UU ministers. Over time, the Welcoming Congregation program emerged to help UU congregations welcome GBLT members and ministers. The sexual revolution had produced conflicting ideas about human sexuality, and the UUA published About Your Sexuality in 1971, the junior high school curriculum designed to promote accurate information and provide an opportunity to get questions answered honestly. This was followed by the OWL program, Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education curriculum, created by the UUA and our cousin, United Church of Christ. First released in 1999, OWL has age-appropriate classes for kindergarten to adults and promotes healthy sexual values around sexuality and relationships, along with accurate information. A 2-year process between 1983 and 1985 led to most of the current principles and sources of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Earth-centered spirituality was added to the sources in 1994. To prevent the principles and sources from becoming a creedal statement, the UUA's bylaws require that these be reviewed periodically. Proposed revisions were brought to General Assembly in 2009, but voted down by delegates. A new UU hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, was published in 1993 with changes to the wording of traditional hymns largely reflecting humanist beliefs, as well as more gender-inclusive language insisted upon by UU women. But near the turn of the current century, a groundswell of demand for the return of more religion and spirituality in UU congregations and services emerged. It echoed the complaints of Ralph Waldo Emerson from almost 200 years before, who spoke of the corpse-cold Unitarianism of his day. Liturgies and music are slowly transforming congregation by congregation. In 2005, Singing the Journey, a supplement to Singing the Living Tradition, was published to introduce hymns that touch the heart as well as the head. In spite of its continual evolution as a religion, Unitarian Universalist churches have not done the best of jobs in keeping up with our rapidly changing society. For many years, parents who had arrived at Unitarian Universalism by earnest searching expected their children to conduct their own earnest search for their religion. You children of my generation were told nothing of our own religion, let alone that it might be a good thing to be a Unitarian Universalist. The result of this is that today, of the approximately 4,000 youth bridging out of our high school programs every year, less than 150 join a UU congregation, either in their home community or another city. The other 3,850 every year are part of the Exodus generation. We can do better. If Unitarian Universalism is irrelevant to our own children who were lovingly raised as UUs, how can we expect it to be relevant to the ever-increasing number of people who feel no societal pressure to attend any church? The Reverend Christine Robinson spoke about this at the recent Pacific Western Regional Assembly. Today, when people decide they want to attend a church, they are not looking for religious freedom. They have religious freedom in the secular world. Today, if people decide to go to church, they do so because they want their lives to have meaning and depth. They are looking for spiritual instruction in how to live their lives. They want to be part of a cause, working for good and making a difference in the world. Our churches, this church, must offer that. One mountain, many paths is not the message that people are looking for these days. More and more people today identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. They are interested in spiritual practice, personal enlightenment, peace of mind, being of service, and learning about religion. They are suspicious of institutions like ours because they think we are religious but not spiritual. They suspect we are more interested in running our churches than in spiritual growth. The Reverend Robinson suggests that we become spiritual but not dogmatic, offering explicitly spiritual messages, spiritual growth, and spiritual practices while retaining our non-creedal, non-dogmatic traditions. Are you ready to begin to imagine what it will take to be a thriving Unitarian Universalist church in the 21st century? To embrace a new generation of Unitarian Universalists? I would love to imagine with you.